we had two very, very absolutely phenomenal speakers. One of them is the Reverend Rafael Malpica Padilla. Rafael, and Bishop Monty said that name very many times. He loved the way that rolled off all the time. Rafael Malpica Padilla. Rafael Malpica Padilla is the Executive Director of the Global Missions for the ELCA. He's the big kahuna up in Chicago working global missions. So what does that mean? That means he has purview of working all of the things that are done in other countries of the world in terms of responses, in response to disasters, in terms of building schools, in terms of building churches, in terms of spreading the word and the gospel out to the larger community. Great guy, and Kelly and I had an opportunity to have lunch with him, just happenstance, and we had lunch with him, and he shared lots of stories. And what it opened my eyes to is, look, we can disagree with decisions that are made at assemblies. That's all well and good. But there's a lot of good stuff that's going on through the ELCA. And I personally, what the revelation that came to me in Synod was, I'd hate to cut off my nose to spite my face. And in particular, I'd hate for us to stop supporting these kind of global missions just because there's some disagreement with regard to some part. So it spoke to me, and I was very nourished by Reverend Padilla. And then we had an extremely, I'm telling you, I thought I was in a Pentecostal church. The Reverend Jemekis Buba, he is the Director of African National Ministries in the ELCA. Again, another ELCA individual right there at the top. Reverend Buba gave two addresses, one talking about being open-minded, again, some reconciliation, and the other one being about open-handed, because you cannot give with clenched fists. And both of those addresses, at different points in the assembly, were absolutely uplifting. And they had his microphone turned up way too loud. We did not need the mics turned up that loud. I was sitting in the front, and Bishop was right over there, and I'm telling you, he was just, crashing us. But he gave very, very spirited about open-mindedness, about the way to look at that, and then open-handed. So then we did business. Obviously, we had a financial plan. Pastor Freeborn kind of mentioned that in the service in terms of the challenges. The Synod has challenged with finances for 2009 and 2010. Giving is down. I think we're seeing the same thing, obviously, in our church. It's a church-wide issue. It's not just here at Glory Day. So they were struggling with it. They had to adjust for their 2010, which ends in this month. They had to adjust their percentage of giving from 50% down to 36%. So a pretty significant amount that did not go forward from our Synod to the ELCA. That was not them saying we don't support you, ELCA, because of the decision you made. It was saying the reality is we can't afford to give that much and maintain the programs that we have. Very much the same as we have done at Glory Day. We've had to manage and change priorities a little bit in order to respond to that. So they've been doing the same thing at Synod. 2011, there are some tough choices potentially to be made. Obviously, we prayed about it a lot at Synod. They do hope to return to a 50% giving to the ELCA, so that was in the budget. There is some talk about potential cuts in staff at the Synod, and that was discussed. And the one in particular that came up in a very veiled way for some, in a very loud way for those who were really listening, was David Lane's position as the youth director.
That would be tragic.
That would be tragic.
And that was the message that was communicated, obviously. Everyone felt that way. Now, when push comes to shove, they don't have a huge budget up there. They've got to remain flexible. We got a lot of inputs on it. I made sure that our table gave an appropriate input, which we do not cut him. And so one of the things that the bishop talked about is establishing a special endowment, potentially, for the youth, which obviously would be an additional offering that he would ask from the area churches to support that and make sure that that ministry was maintained. That was very well received. If you can't do it in the regular budget, maybe you can ask people to give something designated funds for that particular. So anyway, that's how that discussion went. And then we did consider a combination combination of resolutions and memorials, which basically stated this: undo what you did on the vote for human sexuality, undo what you did on the vote for lifelong monogamous gay pastors being accepted, undo what you did to change the polity to allow that to be done. All of these memorials had very similar things. And so we discussed those. Eventually we discussed them. There was kind of a parliamentary procedural issue that prevented discussion initially, but we did get around to discussing them. And I will tell you that the general sentiment of the Assembly, let me tell you what we did last year. At the Assembly last year, the Assembly voted for the human sexuality statement. So that's just a report that says what we believe. We voted on that as a Synod, and we said, it's okay, it's good enough, we can work within it, is what we said. The Synod Assembly voted against all of the other measures, our Virginia Synod. Now obviously when it went up to the church-wide had another opinion of that, but I just want to frame that and say, as a Synod, our Assembly said we do not concur with gay pastors or recognizing gay relationships in the church.
And I might add, that was pretty overwhelming.
Right.
That was pretty overwhelming.
There's no question about it. I mean, the Assembly as a whole agreed to that. This year, those motions came forward. I must admit, I was a little confused when what eventually happened because I thought that the Assembly would wish to try and re-engage that. Even though it probably was a futile effort, it would have made a statement. The Assembly chose to postpone indefinitely all of those measures, and it was upheld by the Assembly. So why did they do that? Again, I believe that the Assembly is ready to move on. It's not an interruption, it's an opportunity. And we need to get on with God's work, because the problem is that this is interrupting God's work. This is taking our energy away from the good stuff that's getting done. That's why I think that whole time that we spent fortuitously, hand of God, with Reverend Padilla, I thought was valuable to me, because he showed me all of the other stuff, and that's just global. I mean, the church itself, ELCA, is doing amazing things. They're doing God's work. And that's what the Assembly pretty much voted. They said, look, let's get on with this. We can work it out. It is still up to the individual congregations to determine what their fate is. And that was substantiated at the Assembly because one of the votes said, or one of the resolutions said, put all this in the bishop's hands. Let him make the decision whether a congregation will or will not accept a gay pastor. Wow. That one wasn't even postponed indefinitely. That was just killed. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is, it is still within the individual congregation. That's how this vote was crafted last year, to say we will recognize it, but we also recognize the inviolable capabilities of the congregation to make that determination. And I think most people are okay with that for right now. And most people are saying, let's get on with the business at hand. Let's get on with the good work that we're doing. We're going to table this, put it aside, and then we'll move on from here. Kelly, you want to? Kelly was there also.
Yeah, I'd just like to add just a little bit to what Joe has said. One of the things that they did that was different in Assembly this year was that we broke down into small groups with other churches and with our own church. And one of the things that in our discussions we talked about was, how has this affected your church? And really, our church is kind of on a different plane right now than a lot of the other churches are, because we've spent the majority of our time dealing with losing our senior pastor. The other churches have really dealt with this. They've had their votes if they were going to have their votes. They've had their discussions if they were going to have their discussions. And they've pretty much had their fallout, whatever that may be, good or bad, within their congregation. And so a lot of them were just sort of saying, boy, it's been a tough year, but what's done is done, and now it's time to go on. And I think it was really interesting that the other groups that we were with were obviously in a really different place than we are. I mean, we're still to the point where we're still having those discussions where a lot of them have made their decision. So I think that's why a lot of them perhaps voted to just continue to move on, because they've done all what they want to do and what their churches have voted to do.